friends. So, I've had really a lovely weekend. It's felt like a bit of a busy weekend because I've had several meetings this weekend, so it hasn't been necessarily downtime, but in a lot of ways it's my favorite way to roll because, having an inspiring conversation there's almost nothing more restorative than that. So I'm just feeling some gratitude for that. And, it's something that because we had a really great creative meeting on MacGyver yesterday, and it was a bit of it was not our first time meeting since the Houston production, but it was our first time really kind of like looking at how we're going to go forward and what we as a team see as the next steps. And what felt really great about the meeting is that there was just a real unity to it. There was a real sense of shared, I think, shared vision in some ways. Although I know that we're not all, there's enough people in that room that we're not always going to all see eye to eye. But even more than a shared sense of exactly how to go, what the piece is going to be going forward, there was a real just a mutual, I think, respect and care given to how we want to approach the process going forward. And that was a really wonderful thing to be part of and to kind of take ownership of as the next chapter of that process starts. And what it flagged for me was something that just in the course of the creative process, there's something that I've noticed, and which is that the creative process, like anything else, happens in cycles of whether it looks like an up and down sine wave or actually an up and down sine wave is just a circle, right? It's a circle. If you're drawing a circle and that circle's moving in a line, then all of a sudden that drawing of the circle turns into a wave. So a wave is a cycle. A wave is cyclical motion in a lot of ways. And the creative process, I spoke about this, I was having some really kind of intense, that was showing up very, very, very distinctly when I was in Houston on the ground, completely immersed in a process. Tends to be that way for me. I become hyper aware of those cycles when I'm really kind of, when I'm really in them. But it's also nice to have some time to reflect and just see, to observe from a little more remove. And something that showed up for me was actually, I remember watching a documentary years and years ago about Trey Parker and Matt Stone, who are the creators of the South Park TV show. And there's a documentary called 7 Days to Air, which is all about them and their process, because they basically created a show, for Comedy Central every week. I don't know how, and it was like a 32-week season or something. They created a show for many, many, many weeks of the year. And every single show was created live each week. So it's not live at the moment of airing, but live in the sense of they created a from scratch new show every week. And of course, if you know anything about South Park, it's so entwined with political and social realities that it kind of had to be. You couldn't write a season in advance and because you're not just telling a story that has its own kind of narrative world. I mean, you are, but it's got to be relevant, and that's the kind of work that I'm also really familiar with creating. So this is an intriguing documentary to watch, and it was just remarkable what you saw them do in 7 days' time, from literally having nothing, brainstorming ideas to something that gets shipped off to Comedy Central to go on the air. But the kind of nugget that jumped out at me from that documentary that I saw this show, I saw this movie probably 10 years ago or something like that, and what still sticks with me is this moment where they talked about, I think it was Matt Stone was talking about how every week they got to where they'd done this so many times. I mean, literally hundreds and hundreds of times they had done this, potentially into the thousands over the kind of decades of that show. They had done it so many times that they started to be able to track really, really reliably at what point in the process each of them would be going through their particular challenges or their particular high points. So in other words, like, Matt was like, yeah, on Tuesday mornings, Trey tends to get really bummed out. That's just kind of like a low point for him. So then I try to do this, like I bring him some McDonald's to kind of like give him a little lift. And then on Thursday afternoons, that's when I tend to get kind of bummed out. And so then, a lot of times, like I'll just leave the studio for an hour and just go take a walk on Thursday afternoons, kind of like clear my head. And then on the final day, when Trey is doing the final edit, it's a really intense moment for him, and he always starts out strong in the morning, but then hits a mountain in the afternoon, and so we have to kind of like bring him some coffee and a donut, or But it was like they had so precisely observed the cycles that they each went through individually. And then there were a number of other team members as well, but they were just so in tune with how that particular iterative creative process affected each of them, themselves and the other ones, that they could. It was like science. It was like literally like mapping like a satellite moving through space. They knew when who was going to be where. And that to me was the thing that's still the kind of standout detail from that show, was just how remarkable that is. Because you also have to figure there aren't too many contexts where people are going to be called upon to repeat a creative cycle in that way, with that level of intensity. You're literally delivering a show to Comedy Central on the same timeline every single week, over and over and over and over again. So it's almost like a laboratory for how that works, and it makes a great laboratory for examining the creative process itself and what some of the dynamics are. What some of the kind of universal laws of creativity are. And but then in kind of reflecting on that, what always stands out to me is the fact that they knew that, like, on Tuesday mornings, Trey was going to get bummed out, and on Thursday afternoons, Matt was just going to need some space, right? The fact that they knew that didn't prevent those things from happening. In other words, I think we sometimes, especially when we really do kind of, well, especially when we're investing in a new creative endeavor, it's easy to think that when we feel low, that we're doing something wrong, that there's something we should be doing differently, because we shouldn't feel low. But this example, and of course, on the flip side of that, we love it when we feel high. We love it when we're feeling great and generative, and we love it when it's like we're just in the flow, in the zone. Ideas pouring out of us, there's an ease. But I think this example highlights the fact that being in the zone and in the flow does not mean that there won't be those low points. Those low points in the cycle are there because it's a cycle. They're not there because you got off track. You know, if someone, after hundreds of iterative processes, continues to feel that same low at the same point in the process, to the point where it's almost like they have total objectivity over their own emotional life because they've seen it so many times, that they might be, even though it happens to them emotionally, they're not grabbed by it. They're not derailed by it. Like when Tuesday morning rolls around and Trey gets bummed out, he doesn't go, oh crap, well, maybe this week's episode is just going to be nothing. You know, maybe I just haven't got it this week. It didn't signal that at all. It just became something that they could embrace and understand, and then take, to the extent that it was necessary, take some measures to cope with that and support that, but also not read any more significance into it other than it's part of the cycle. And I think that's something that, even in my own piano playing, I notice this. I notice that I go through phases of having boundless energy for the piano and boundless desire to sit at the keyboard and work. And then phases where I have to kind of nudge myself. I have to give myself a bit of a boost to go and do that work. Interestingly, the longer I do this, the less of a correlation there is between whether I come there with like boundless enthusiasm, or whether I come there with kind of like a more like, okay, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna make myself do this practice. I'm just gonna bring myself here because it's my practice. There's less of a correlation between how I show up there and the effectiveness or the depth, or even how satisfied I feel during the practice session. Once I start, and if I really commit to the practice and I do the work, even a practice session where I showed up thinking that I didn't really have the energy for it can be a deeply rewarding one, and I can just know that I've made progress that day. So again, it's kind of like not about needing to feel good or needing to be at the high point of the cycle. And it's really much more about embracing the fact that these things are cyclical, and that if we hit lows, they may be as much part of the flow, of being in flow, as when we feel great. I think ultimately, as a kind of, as somebody who I think, it's deeply important to me to have a creative life and to have creative practices. There's a showing up that really is necessary kind of throughout. The fact that Trey gets bummed out on Tuesday mornings doesn't mean he doesn't show up. It just means he shows up on Tuesday mornings, and he's prepared to be there in whatever state he's there. So I think this is, I'm bringing this to my own attention because I think it informs. Like when I have a couple days, like just even the last couple days, it's interesting. I had several weeks where it was like, please just let me to the piano. That's all I want to do is play. And then I had a couple days where I was like, oh, it's usually, a lot of times it's like I'll learn a new song and I'll start to overcome the initial hurdles of the song, and it's exciting, and I'm like, this is wonderful, this is beautiful, this is fun. I feel the expansion happening, and then you kind of hit that plateau where the difference between just kind of barely knowing it, barely being able to do it, or somewhat competently being able to do it, and really at being excellent, is a much longer span of time for a much smaller change in the tangible, concrete outcome. that's oftentimes where, in my case, I'll have like, oh, now, it starts to be more. It's like I know that it's going to take more work to go a shorter distance, basically. And now, if you know anything about piano, you know it's not really a shorter distance. It's actually, that's the real distance. That's the road. That is literally putting the miles on the road behind you. We just have to understand that you might practice for 3 days, and someone on the outside would barely know the difference between what you were doing 3 days ago and now. But oh no, major changes have taken place. So there's a kind of consistency throughout those cycles that I think is actually really key to making progress over time. But there's also got to be a real gentleness with ourselves as to how how the emotional kind of roller coaster of doing a creative job is an emotional roller coaster. And it's that because that's the stuff we're working with. We're working with emotion. We're working with conscious experience. So it's only kind of appropriate that we go through some variations in that. It's healthy, and it's part of what informs our expression. So learning to embrace that is what I'm encouraging myself to do. So that's where I am today, people. Hope you had a lovely weekend. Love you. Appreciate you. I'll see you tomorrow.